Welcome back to Negotiation Tactics. Last week I promised I would be introducing my model of escalating angry, destructive conflict and reviewing some of the recommendations that I have made in former lectures and adding some recommendations. There's a lot of material to cover this week. I don't expect you to master it. But for those of you who are studying negotiation tactics, perhaps you're a law enforcement officer, a prison guard, a teacher, a parent, someone who works with or lives angry conflict, I think you will find this model and my recommendations valuable. Let me turn once again to my PowerPoint for this week. Now, my model of escalating conflict is based on my own field-tested experience working with angry people, mediating, angry conflicts, working at times with people with histories of physical violence. So it's been tested again and again in the heat and the fire of real conflict. Let's turn to my PowerPoint now. My model of escalating conflict, a little bit of drama, but it represents the real world challenge, starts with a bell curve. And I would like to start this explanation at the very bottom, at the left hand, my left hand side, the bottom of the bell curve, before any conflict has been triggered. Now, I'm not going to be going to the other side, the right-handed side of the bell curve, because that's post-violence, that's post-peak of anger, and I just don't have the time to review it all. But I will start with what I'll call the baseline of normal day-to-day experience, and what social psychologists tell us is that we learn how to live our day-to-day life, what triggers conflict, what doesn't trigger conflict, as part of our social learning and our cultural upbringing. Cultural spillover theory will tell us that our children act the way we act. They study us, we're their role models, and so they copy us. And all of us have been given what Albert Ellis called root expectations for living day-to-day life as part of our childhood. So one of the triggers of conflict, anger, frustration, whatever, stress, is a violation of these root expectations that we carry within us. Other triggers include what is referred to by psychology as frustration-aggression theory. Some of us, have lower tolerance for frustration, and some of us have actually learned aggression as our response to conflict. Let me share a couple of other explanations for what triggers conflict. Stress research shows that stress will trigger conflict, and that the more stress we are experiencing, the more angry, even rageful we can become. So I don't have the time. I normally spend the time in theories of conflict reviewing this research, but for negotiation tactics, it's important to be aware of your stress level as well as the other negotiator's stress level, because you might be triggered into a rage by some relatively simple, harmless event because you're burnt out, you haven't been taking good care of yourself. We all know those days when we're feeling tired and more irritable. We actually, at peak of stress, burnout, can literally become sick. Some of you may have heard this research study of the perceptions of those who physically attack other human beings that I share in theories of conflict. I'd like to quickly summarize it here so that when you're negotiating, you don't step on somebody's toes by being perceived this way. Attackers will describe the person they attack as starting the conflict. You know, they were the ones whose tactics were nasty. Maybe they have experienced disinterest, a coldness in response to their concerns, or they actually have perceived the person they attack as being aggressive and nasty towards them, humiliating them, putting them down. These are some of the possible triggers. And then the last model I want to introduce as part of triggering conflict and escalating angry conflict is the Kubler-Ross model of grieving. Some of you may have studied this in a death or dying course or some other grief course. What Kubler-Ross found in studying people who were dying is that they went through a predictable cycle. And what I want to stress and introduce to you today is that at a certain part of grieving a loss, and you know, many of us are grieving losses as we speak, but we don't share those losses with each other. So you might be in a negotiation with somebody who's recently separated from their spouse, for example. Sadly, I was with a friend this morning who may be losing a second child to cancer. You know, we all go, grieving the loss of a job is another possibility. Unless we gather information from the other negotiators and get a sense of what's going on in their life, we may unknowingly and innocently trigger rage, trigger a reaction, and then what do we do? Well, here's what I'm going to recommend if you're in a negotiation and the other parties get triggered and angry. First of all, you must suspend judgment. As I said, you can actually trigger someone if you are judging them and they feel put down by you, humiliated by you. Once again, I'm going to recommend that you listen with sincere interest and, if possible, empathy. Now, I haven't yet given the lecture on reframing positions into interests, detoxifying language, laundering language. That will be my lecture next week. But once you learn and start to practice reframing language, doing it skillfully and with astute insight into what is troubling the other person, works beautifully. Well, let's say you tried all those recommended responses and the person is still upset. Maybe they're actually becoming even more upset. Well, some of the possible explanations that hopefully you've been introduced to in theories of conflict are the fact that most human beings have a self-serving bias. At our worst, we will project onto other people and see in others our own weaknesses. So somebody might be getting really upset with you because they see you as putting them down, humiliating them, and actually that's what they're doing to you in their mind. Unless we work hard at becoming extraordinarily honest with ourselves and seeking feedback from trusted others, most human beings walk around in denial about all of this. And with our self-serving bias, we will minimize our nasty tactics, excuse and justify what we're doing. We simply cannot see ourselves as others do. So let's say you've tried my recommendations with triggers. The person appears to be getting hooked in one of the ways I just described. What do you do? Now, in my experience, if you are able to skillfully, sincerely use empathetic listening and insightfully identify the upset person's most important interest or need, most human beings will diffuse, calm down. They will not go to stage 3 or stage 4. There is an important exception to this, though. The bullies of the world, people who have used their power and nasty tactics to intimidate and control other human beings, will continue to escalate because they have absolutely no interest in a good faith win-win negotiation. And the recommendation, if this occurs, is to quickly and firmly assert negotiated boundaries. Now, usually in negotiations, we don't think about negotiating boundaries. That's more what we study in mediation. You know, ground rules are what we call negotiated boundaries, at least the way I teach them, as negotiated multicultural ground rules, rather than just a few simple ground rules that the mediator gives the parties. I'm going to recommend, unless you know the other negotiator well, you know their cultural expectations, you have a sense of what their root expectations and triggers are, that you explore negotiated ground rules with other negotiators as well. And you do it early on before there's any triggered conflict, before you've done much interaction with each other. Because, for example, if you agree that neither of you will raise your voice, that if anybody wants to ask for time away to think about information, to do some homework, that's okay. If you've negotiated those understandings, then in the face of angry, escalating conflict, it's not difficult to quickly remind the other parties, negotiators, of what you agreed to. I think, I hope you've studied I statements and using I statements for assertive communication in NCR 508. If you haven't, you really should find a way to study I statements, because you must use I statements at this point. If someone is angry, you want to be still connecting with them and respectfully disengaging. You don't want to be turning your back on them, further humiliating, putting them down. That's the worst thing you could do. That could send it over the top to the peak. But I'm assuming you have already studied using I statements. And if you get in the habit of negotiating understandings with the process understandings with the other negotiators in advance of the negotiation, saying, I think we're violating this boundary, or I don't think we're doing what we agreed to do early on, is a relatively simple way to quickly, firmly assert boundaries and respectfully disengage in a safe way. Good luck. I've given you a lot of information this week, and I'm assuming you've studied some of this in other courses in our program. If not, just jot down a note that you need to study that particular topic, that it will benefit you in the face of anger, especially if there might be anyone involved who has a history, a pattern of bullying or physical violence. All of these skills work in the fire of angry, destructive conflict, and in the worst of, the most contentious, aggressive of negotiations. But once again, they take practice, and I don't want you to overwhelm yourselves. Pick one or two skills that you're going to practice, learn, and develop, discuss with me and your classmates this week. Have a wonderful week. I'll see you soon.